Story 1: The van that wasn't there. The van was supposed to be their freedom. Emma had found it on Craigslist for a steal, $3,500 for a 1987 Volkswagen Westphalia, fully refurbished, with a pop-top roof and a sink that actually worked. It was a little rough around the edges, sure, but Jake had spent weeks sanding down the rust, repainting the exterior a deep forest green, and replacing the tires. They'd named it Wendy, a nod to Jake's obsession with The Shining, and now, as they cruised down a two-lane highway somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, Emma couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. This was their home on wheels, their ticket to adventure. Next exit's the campground, Jake said, glancing at the GPS on his phone. His dark hair was messy from the drive, and his flannel shirt was rolled up to his elbows. Emma loved how he looked like this, relaxed, unguarded. It was a far cry from the stressed-out version of him she'd seen during finals week. "Good," Emma replied, stretching her legs. "I'm ready to get out of this thing for a bit." "No offense, Wendy." The van didn't respond, of course, but for a moment, Emma thought she felt the engine shudder beneath her feet. She shook it off. Probably just a pothole. The campground was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like the woods are holding their breath. It was late October, and the air smelled of damp leaves and pine. The sun was already dipping below the trees, casting long shadows across the gravel lot. Emma counted 3 other vehicles, a pickup truck with a camper shell, a Subaru with a kayak strapped to the roof, and another van. She froze. "Jake," she said, her voice low. "Look." He followed her gaze to the van parked 2 spots over. It was identical to theirs, same forest green paint, same pop-top roof, even the same scratch on the bumper near the passenger door. "Weird," Jake said, frowning. "Same model, I guess. But the scratch? That's kind of creepy." Emma didn't like it. She didn't like the way the van seemed to sit there, silent and watchful, like it was waiting for something. She didn't like the way the trees seemed to close in around the campground, their branches clawing at the sky. "Let's just set up camp," she said, forcing a smile. "I'm starving." They built a fire, cooked hot dogs on a portable grill, and cracked open a couple of beers. The night was cool but not cold, and the stars were bright overhead. For a while, Emma forgot about the other van. But as the fire died down and the woods grew darker, she found her eyes drifting back to it. "Do you think anyone's in there?" she asked. Jake shrugged. "Dunno. Maybe they're already asleep. Or out hiking. But the lights are off. Wouldn't they at least have a lantern or something?" Jake didn't answer. He was staring at the van too now, his brow furrowed. "Let's just go to bed," he said finally. "We've got a long drive tomorrow." The next morning, the other van was gone. Emma noticed it first. She'd woken up early, the way she always did when they camped, and stepped outside to make coffee. The spot where the van had been was empty, the gravel undisturbed, as if it had never been there at all. "Jake," she called, knocking on the side of their van. "The other van's gone." He poked his head out of the pop-top, his hair sticking up in every direction. "Huh. Guess they left early. But there's no tire tracks or anything. It's like it just vanished." Jake climbed down and joined her, squinting at the empty spot. Maybe it rained last night and washed them away. It hadn't rained. Emma was sure of that. The first strange thing happened later that day. They were back on the road, the radio playing softly, when Emma reached into the glove compartment for a pack of gum. Her fingers brushed against something cold and smooth. She pulled it out, a keychain, shaped like a tiny van. "Jake," she said, holding it up. "Did you put this in here?" He glanced over. "Nope. Never seen it before." Emma frowned. The keychain looked old, the paint chipped and faded. It was the same forest green as their van. Weird, she muttered, tossing it back into the glove compartment. The second strange thing happened that night. They'd parked at another campground, this one even more remote than the last. Emma was brushing her teeth in the van's tiny sink when she noticed something written on the mirror in foggy letters. "Don't trust it." She froze, her heart pounding. The writing was smudged, as if someone had wiped it away in a hurry, but it was unmistakable. And it was in her handwriting. "Jake," she called, her voice trembling. He came running, his face pale. "What's wrong?" She pointed at the mirror. "Look." But the writing was gone. The third strange thing happened the next morning. Emma woke up to find Jake staring at her, his expression unreadable. "What?" she asked, sitting up. "Your hair," he said slowly. "It's shorter." Emma reached up, her fingers brushing against her scalp. He was right, her hair, which had been shoulder-length the night before, now barely grazed her ears. "What the hell?" she whispered. Jake didn't answer. He was looking at the van's interior, his eyes wide. "Emma," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't our van." She followed his gaze. The curtains were different, a floral pattern she didn't recognize. The seats were a darker shade of brown. And the scratch on the bumper outside the passenger door was gone. By the time they reached the next town, they were both on edge. Emma insisted they stop at a diner, hoping the bright lights and the smell of coffee would ground them. But as they sat in a booth, picking at their pancakes, Jake suddenly went still. "Emma," he said, his voice low. "Look." She turned. Parked outside the diner was the other van, their van. The forest green paint, the pop-top roof, the scratch on the bumper. "That's impossible," she whispered. "We're driving it." Jake shook his head. "No. We're not." They ran outside, but the van was gone. When they returned to their table, the waitress gave them a strange look. "You folks okay?" she asked. "Did you see that van outside?" Emma demanded. The waitress frowned. "What van?" The final straw came that night. They'd parked at a rest stop, too exhausted to keep driving. Emma was lying in the back of the van, staring at the ceiling, when she heard a faint tapping. "Jake," she whispered. "Do you hear that?" He didn't answer. She turned to look at him and froze. He wasn't Jake. The man lying beside her had Jake's face, but his hair was longer, his features sharper. He looked like a distorted version of her boyfriend, as if someone had tried to recreate him from memory and gotten it wrong. "Jake," she said, her voice trembling. He opened his eyes, and they weren't his eyes. They were black, like the void between stars. "Emma," he said, his voice echoing strangely. "Don't trust it." The van was alive. Emma didn't know how she knew, but she did. It was feeding on them, replacing them piece by piece, until there would be nothing left but empty shells. And the other van, the one that wasn't there, was a warning. A glimpse of what was to come. She tried to leave. She packed her bag, grabbed the keys, and ran. But no matter how far she drove, the van always brought her back. And now, as she sits in the driver's seat, staring at her reflection in the rearview mirror, she realizes the truth. The van isn't just replacing them. It's becoming them. And soon, there won't be anything left of Emma and Jake at all. Story 2: The Hitchhiker's Toll. The van was a 1992 Dodge Ram, the kind of vehicle that had seen better days but still had enough life in it to get you where you needed to go. Sarah had bought it off a neighbor for a song, and now, as they cruised down a desolate stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere, she was starting to regret it. The engine rattled like a box of loose screws, and the air conditioning had given up the ghost somewhere in Nebraska. "Are we there yet?" whined Lily from the back seat. She was 8, with her mother's auburn hair and her father's stubborn streak. "No," Sarah said, trying to keep the irritation out of her voice. "We've got another hour or so." "I'm bored," Lily said, crossing her arms. "Play with your brother," Sarah suggested. Lily glanced at 6-year-old Ben, who was busy making engine noises as he pushed a toy car along the edge of his booster seat. "He's annoying." "You're annoying," Ben shot back, without looking up. "Kids," David said, his voice sharp. "Enough." Sarah glanced at her husband. He was gripping the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. He'd been quiet all day, which wasn't like him. Usually, he was the one cracking jokes, trying to keep everyone's spirits up. But something about this trip had gotten under his skin. "You okay?" she asked. He nodded, but his eyes stayed fixed on the road. "Just tired." It was nearly midnight when they saw the hitchhiker. He was standing on the side of the road, his thumb out, his face shadowed by the brim of a baseball cap. He wore a flannel shirt and jeans, and a duffel bag sat at his feet. "Should we pick him up?" Sarah asked, glancing at David. "No," David said immediately. "It's not safe." "He looks harmless," Sarah said. "And it's the middle of nowhere. What if his car broke down?" David hesitated, then sighed. "Fine. But if he tries anything, I'm kicking him out." They pulled over, and the hitchhiker climbed into the back seat, his duffel bag clutched in one hand. Up close, he looked to be in his late 30s, with a scruffy beard and tired eyes. "Thanks," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Car broke down a few miles back." "No problem," Sarah said, forcing a smile. "I'm Sarah. This is David, and our kids, Lily and Ben." The hitchhiker nodded but didn't offer his name. They drove in silence for a while, the only sound the rumble of the van's engine and the occasional snore from Ben, who had fallen asleep. Sarah kept glancing at the hitchhiker in the rearview mirror. There was something off about him, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. "There's a campsite up ahead," the hitchhiker said suddenly, breaking the silence. "You should stop there for the night." David frowned. "We're trying to make it to the next town." "You won't make it," the hitchhiker said, his tone final. The roads closed up ahead. "Flooding." Sarah and David exchanged a look. They hadn't heard anything about flooding. "How do you know?" Sarah asked. The hitchhiker didn't answer. The campsite was secluded, surrounded by dense woods. There were no other vehicles, no signs of life except for the occasional hoot of an owl. The hitchhiker helped them set up their tent, then disappeared into the trees without a word. "Weird guy," David muttered as they zipped up the tent. "Yeah," Sarah agreed. "But at least he was helpful." The next morning, the hitchhiker was gone. Sarah noticed it first. She'd woken up early, as usual, and stepped outside to make coffee. The campsite was eerily quiet, the air thick with mist. The hitchhiker's duffel bag was gone, and there was no sign that he'd ever been there. "David," she called, knocking on the side of the van. "The hitchhiker's gone." He poked his head out of the tent, his hair sticking up in every direction. "Huh. Guess he left early. But there's no footprints or anything. It's like he just vanished." David climbed out and joined her, squinting at the empty campsite. "Maybe he didn't want to wake us." Sarah didn't buy it, but she didn't argue. The first strange thing happened later that day. They were back on the road, the kids bickering in the back seat, when David suddenly swore under his breath. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked. "The odometer," he said, his voice tight. "It's rolled back." Sarah leaned over to look. The odometer, which had read 120,000 miles the day before, now showed 110,000. "That's impossible," she said. David didn't answer. He was staring at the road ahead, his jaw clenched. The second strange thing happened that night. They'd parked at another campsite, this one even more remote than the last. Sarah was brushing her teeth in the van's tiny sink when she noticed something written on the mirror in foggy letters. "Don't trust him." She froze, her heart pounding. The writing was smudged, as if someone had wiped it away in a hurry, but it was unmistakable. And it was in her handwriting. "David," she called, her voice trembling. He came running, his face pale. "What's wrong?" She pointed at the mirror. "Look." But the writing was gone. The third strange thing happened the next morning. Sarah woke up to find David staring at her, his expression unreadable. "What?" she asked, sitting up. "Your hair," he said slowly. "It's shorter." Sarah reached up, her fingers brushing against her scalp. He was right, her hair, which had been shoulder-length the night before, now barely grazed her ears. "What the hell?" she whispered. David didn't answer. He was looking at the van's interior, his eyes wide. "Sarah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't our van." She followed his gaze. The curtains were different, a floral pattern she didn't recognize. The seats were a darker shade of brown. And the odometer now read 100,000 miles. By the time they reached the next town, they were both on edge. Sarah insisted they stop at a diner, hoping the bright lights and the smell of coffee would ground them. But as they sat in a booth, picking at their pancakes, David suddenly went still. "Sarah," he said, his voice low. "Look." She turned. Parked outside the diner was the hitchhiker. He looked older now, his beard streaked with gray, his face lined with wrinkles. "That's impossible," she whispered. David shook his head. "No. It's not." They ran outside, but the hitchhiker was gone. When they returned to their table, the waitress gave them a strange look. "You folks okay?" she asked. "Did you see that man outside?" Sarah demanded. The waitress frowned. "What man?" The final straw came that night. They'd parked at a rest stop, too exhausted to keep driving. Sarah was lying in the back of the van, staring at the ceiling, when she heard a faint tapping. "David," she whispered. "Do you hear that?" He didn't answer. She turned to look at him and froze. He wasn't David. The man lying beside her had David's face, but his hair was longer, his features sharper. He looked like a distorted version of her husband, as if someone had tried to recreate him from memory and gotten it wrong. "David," she said, her voice trembling. He opened his eyes, and they weren't his eyes. They were black, like the void between stars. "Sarah," he said, his voice echoing strangely. "Don't trust him." The hitchhiker wasn't a man. Sarah didn't know how she knew, but she did. He was a curse, a malevolent force that had latched onto their van, feeding on them, replacing them piece by piece, until there would be nothing left but empty shells. She tried to leave. She packed her bag, grabbed the keys, and ran. But no matter how far she drove, the van always brought her back. And now, as she sits in the driver's seat, staring at her reflection in the rearview mirror, she realizes the truth. The van isn't just replacing them. It's becoming them. And soon, there won't be anything left of Sarah and David at all. Story 3: The Static Between Stations. The desert was a vast, empty expanse, stretching out in every direction like a sea of sand and scrub. Marcus had been driving for hours, the sun blazing overhead, the heat shimmering on the horizon. He'd left the city behind days ago, trading skyscrapers for cacti and traffic for tumbleweeds. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to clear his head. But now, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the temperature began to drop, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The van was a 1980s Chevy G20, the kind of vehicle that had seen better days but still had enough life in it to get you where you needed to go. Marcus had bought it off a guy in Phoenix for a song, and now, as he cruised down a desolate stretch of highway, he was starting to regret it. The engine rattled like a box of loose screws, and the air conditioning had given up the ghost somewhere in New Mexico. He reached for the radio, hoping to find some music to drown out the silence. But all he got was static, a low, hissing sound that seemed to fill the van. He twisted the dial, searching for a station, but the static only grew louder. And then, faintly, he heard a voice. It was distorted, barely audible over the static, but it was there. A man's voice, whispering something Marcus couldn't quite make out. "Hello?" Marcus said, leaning closer to the radio. The voice didn't respond. Instead, it began to recite a series of numbers, coordinates, Marcus realized. "What the hell?" he muttered, grabbing a pen and scribbling the numbers on the back of a gas receipt. The voice stopped, and the static returned. Marcus didn't believe in ghosts or aliens or any of that nonsense. He was a practical man, the kind who believed in hard work and cold beer and minding his own business. But there was something about the voice on the radio that got under his skin. It was like a splinter he couldn't quite dig out, nagging at him, demanding his attention. So, against his better judgment, he followed the coordinates. They led him to an abandoned ranger station, tucked away in a remote corner of the desert. The building was small and squat, with peeling paint and a sagging roof. The windows were dark, and the door hung open, creaking in the wind. Marcus parked the van and stepped out, the gravel crunching under his boots. The air was cool now, the desert night closing in around him. He pulled a flashlight from the van and clicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. "Hello?" he called, his voice echoing off the walls of the station. There was no answer. The inside of the station was a mess, broken furniture, scattered papers, and a thick layer of dust that covered everything. Marcus swept the flashlight around, the beam catching on a desk in the corner. There was a journal on the desk, its cover worn and cracked. He picked it up and flipped it open, the pages crackling under his fingers. The handwriting was messy, the ink faded, but he could still make out the words. October 12, 1998, picked up the signal last night. Coordinates led me here. Something's not right. The radio, it's talking to me. Telling me to join them. I don't know who they are, but I think they're watching me. Marcus frowned, flipping to the next page. October 13, 1998, found another journal. Same handwriting. Same entries. But it's not mine. I don't understand. The radio won't stop. It's in my head now. I can't leave. The van won't start. They're coming for me. The next page was blank, but there were more entries further on, dozens of them, all written in the same handwriting, all detailing the same experience. Marcus's heart was pounding now, his palms slick with sweat. He flipped to the last entry. October 15, 1998, they're here. I can hear them outside. The radio, it's not a radio anymore. It's them. They're inside it. Inside me. I can't fight it. I don't want to. I'm joining them. The entry ended there, the final words smeared, as if the writer had been interrupted. Marcus dropped the journal, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He turned to leave, but the flashlight beam caught something on the wall, a series of tally marks, scratched into the wood. There were dozens of them, maybe more. And then he heard it, the static. It was faint at first, a low hiss that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. But it grew louder, filling the station, filling his head. And then, faintly, he heard the voice. Join us. Marcus bolted for the door, but it slammed shut before he could reach it. He yanked on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Let me out, he shouted, pounding on the door. The static grew louder, the voice more insistent. "Join us." Marcus turned, his back pressed against the door, the flashlight beam sweeping the room. The journal was gone, the desk overturned. And then he saw them, shadows, moving in the corners of the room, creeping closer. "No," he whispered, his voice trembling. "No, no, no." The shadows reached for him, their fingers cold and sharp, and the static filled his ears, drowning out his screams. When Marcus woke up, he was in the van. The engine was running, the radio playing softly. He sat up, his head pounding, his mouth dry. The desert stretched out around him, the sun rising on the horizon. "What the hell?" he muttered, rubbing his eyes. And then he saw it, the journal, sitting on the passenger seat. He picked it up, his hands shaking, and flipped it open. The pages were blank, except for the last one. There, in his own handwriting, were the words. "Join us." Marcus tried to leave. He packed his bag, grabbed the keys, and ran. But no matter how far he drove, the van always brought him back to the station. And now, as he sits in the driver's seat, staring at his reflection in the rearview mirror, he realizes the truth. The van isn't just a vehicle. It's a trap. And he's the bait.